All right. Well, hey, we're in a series in the book of Exodus. So, for our passage kids who are in here with us, we've been in Exodus now for about 15 weeks. And so, we are still there. We are coming down the home stretch. We've got this week and we got next week, and we will move on from the book of Exodus. And so, hopefully, it has been for you what it has been in my life. It has given us a better picture of who God is, God's power, God's involvement, God's engagement into our life, God's care, God's concern for us. We have learned about some attributes of who God is and what God has done, and hopefully you've enjoyed this journey through the book of Exodus. If not, we've only got 2 more weeks, so just hang on. All right, just hang on, and we will jump into a new series in a couple of weeks. In the 90s, there was a football and there was a baseball player named Deion Sanders. Now, you may know him now as Coach Prime if you're still into sports, but in the 90s, Deion, he played both football and baseball. Matter of fact, in Atlanta, he played a football and a baseball game in the same day. And he played for a number of teams, but he played both football and baseball, the last kind of dual athlete that we've seen. In the 90s, a commercial came out. Later, he would leave Atlanta and he would go to the Cowboys. And there was a commercial that came out with him and the owner of the Cowboys named Jerry Jones. And Jerry Jones and Deion are sitting up in the press box looking over the field there at Cowboy Stadium. And he says, "Deion, what'll it be?" He said, "Will it be football or will it be baseball?" And Deion Sanders looked at Jerry Jones and says, "It'll be both." And then he looks at Deion and says, "Okay, well, in football, will it be offense or will it be defense?" Because, also about Deion Sanders, he liked to play offense and defense in football. And he says, "Will it be offense or will it be defense?" And Deion Sanders looks at him and says, "It'll be both." And then in contract negotiations, he says, "Deion, what will it be? Will it be 15 million or will it be 20 million?" And Deion looks at the coach and he says, "It'll be both." And eventually, what they get to is they get to Pizza Hut pizza, of course, obviously, like that's the logical connection. He says, "Will it be meat lovers pizza or will it be stuffed crust pizza?" And the climax of the commercial is when Dion looks at Jerry Jones and says a sentence that changed your life and mine. "It'll be both. Meat lovers with stuffed crust pizza." How can you have both? Both of those. Today, we're going to see in the text where Moses is going to say to God, "God, I want both. God, I want both your promises and I want your presence. God, I don't just want both. God, we must have both. We need your promises and we need your presence," because what we saw last week was that the golden calf was made and the golden calf was worshiped. They stopped worshiping God in the right way, broke commandments 1 and 2, and the presence of God is withdrawn from the people. The promises of God remain, but his presence is withdrawn, and Moses is going to go to God on behalf of his people, and he's going to make a plea for both. So let's go. Exodus chapter 33, verse 1. We read this. "The Lord spoke to Moses, 'Go up from here, you and the people you brought up from the land of Egypt to the land I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your offspring. I will send an angel ahead of you and will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Go to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you because you are a stiff-necked people. Otherwise, I might destroy you on the way.'" Now look at verse 1. Right? We saw last week where he says, "Hey, these are your people." All throughout the book of Exodus, he's referred to the people of God as his people. These are my people, God would say. And then last week, after the sin of the golden calf, he looks at Moses, he says, "Hey, these are your people. These are your people." And here he calls them not your people, not my people. He says, the people. What's he signifying in this language? He's signifying, hey, I've removed my presence from them. But he says, here's the deal. My promises are my promises. And so I'm not going to pull the promise. I'm going to pull my presence. So you can still go, and you can go fight the Hivites, and you can go fight the Jebusites, you can go fight all the ites, and when you fight the ites, you're going to win. I'm just not going to be with you. And he's saying, look, you can have the promises of God without the presence of God. Because, see, what they say last week, they say, "God, we don't need you. God, we're going to withdraw relationally from you. And so, God, in our withdrawing from you, what we're saying to you, God, is we can do this without you and we don't need you. And God says, if that's what you want, then that's what you can have, and I'll withdraw. And they instead embraced idol worship. See, here's what's happened. They said, I'm going to worship the wrong God in the wrong way in hopes that the God, this false God can give me something that this real God can't. And in an attempt to meet with the presence of God, actually, God was driven further from them. See, I was thinking I might get meaning, purpose, and value from worshiping this thing that was not God. But in worshiping the thing that is not God, I actually get drove further from God. And the same thing happens in your life. The same thing happens in my life when I look to something other than God to provide meaning, purpose, and value. It doesn't draw me closer to God. It draws me further from Him. And it doesn't have the nearness to God. It isolates me from God. We talked a little bit about idols last week, but we said an idol is something you give your attention to, something that preoccupies your thoughts. Martin Luther says it this way, whatever a man loves, that is his God, for he carries it in his heart. He goes about with it night and day. He sleeps and wakes with it. But be it what it may, wealth or self or pleasure or renown, whatever a man loves, he carries in his heart. And that is his God. Whatever you love the most, you will worship the most. Whatever you're most passionate about will be the thing that you worship the most. Whatever occupies your mind the most is likely the thing that you worship the most. So let me ask you a question before we go on, before we talk about these pleas that God makes for his people. We kind of touched on it last week, and I don't want to move forward into this week without kind of retracing our steps for one, those who weren't here, or those who just kind of, maybe we left here and went about our week, and we didn't really search our hearts and ask God, reveal the idols in my heart. We didn't ask the questions, God, what are the things that I love the most? God, and is there a chance that I actually worship those things more than I worship you? What are the things that preoccupy my mind the most? What are the things that I'm certain that I need for life and happiness? God, what are the things that I look to provide meaning, purpose, and value in life? Martin Luther says, well, it could be wealth, it could be self, it could be pleasure, it could be renown, and that just kind of scratches the surface of where you and I may look for idols in our own life. The Israelite creates idols. They are looking for meaning, purpose, and value. All the things that they are intended to find in God, they seek to find them somewhere else. You think that you'll actually fulfill your life, but you'll actually drive yourself further from fulfillment, because we were not meant to find meaning, purpose, and value in anything else other than God. That's not how you and I were created. The Israelites were facing life without God. There would be no divine presence in the camp. There would be no tabernacle, no altar, no lampstand, no table for bread, no incense for prayer, no ark for atonement. God had removed his presence. And here's the offer that he's giving to the Israelites. Here's the offer he's putting on the table in verses 1 through 3. You can have all my promises, but I will bless you apart from a relationship with you. I'll bless you. I'll still do good, be good. I will still keep up everything that I've said I would do. I will fulfill all my promises, and you'll get all the promises, but you won't get the relationship. Is that good enough? Some of us might hear that and we think, well, that'd be pretty good. No worship of God, no living for God, no keeping the commandments of God, but I get all the benefits of God. Think about that for a minute. If that offer was on the table for you, you don't have to keep the commandments. You don't have to worship God. You don't have to live for God, but you get all the promises God offers. You in on that? If you could go to heaven and get to experience all that there is in heaven, except there be no God, you still excited about it? It's what's on the table for them. And they're not okay with it. They're not okay with the offer that God has put on the table. Look at verse 4. What do? When the people heard this bad news to them. They mourned and they did not put on their jewelry. For the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites, you are a stiff-necked people. Here we are back at stiff-necked. They're not obedient. If I went up with you for a single moment, I would destroy you. Now take off your jewelry, and I will decide what to do with you. So the Israelites remained stripped of their jewelry from Mount Horeb onward. What happens is they're taking off their jewelry as this sign of repentance before God, as to say the false gods in Egypt where we obtained this jewelry, and every false god since they've been connected to this jewelry, we lay it down and we say, God, we only want you. There's this interesting thing the commentator pointed out this week as I was studying for this week. He said, you can kind of trace the spiritual vitality of the Israelite people by looking at one thing. What are they doing with their gold? He says, if you will see throughout the history of the Israelite people what they're doing with their gold, you can figure out where they are in relationship with God. What they do with their resources, with their possessions, with the things they deem to be most valuable, you can look at that, and through a study of what they're doing, you can kind of point to and understand where they are in relationship with God. It's not too different for us, is it? When you evaluate what you do with the things God has entrusted to you, when you evaluate what you do with your money or with your talents or with your gifting or with your resources, see, we can kind of see where we are with God. Jesus said it this way. He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That what you treasure or where your heart is, that's where you'll kind of put your money. And those two things kind of go hand in hand. So if we were to ask the question, if we just say we're average, we kind of fall in the average category of spending in America. Let's just say that. And if I were to ask you the question, do you think that Christians in the United States spent more on health, wellness, and beauty products, or in being generous with what God entrusted them to what he's called them to be generous towards? Where would the scales balance out on that? Health, wealth, and beauty, or giving to his church? What do you think it would be? Don't answer that. Maybe this. How about this one? What if we average the person spends on entertainment a month versus what they would spend or give to their local church? Where does that balance out? What do you think it is? Let's go another one. Maybe those two aren't right. How about internet in their home? Internet in their home, cable television in their home. If we just say, where do you spend more in those versus giving? If you answered the church on any of those, you're wrong. And Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. And what we see in the Israelite people, you can kind of trace the spiritual condition of their heart to what they do with their money. And the same is true for me and you, according to Jesus. And we see that here, that they lay down their gold. And we go verse 7. Now Moses took a tent and pitched it outside the camp and at a distance from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. Anyone who wanted to consult with the Lord would go to the tent of the meeting. It was outside the camp. Remember that the tabernacle, what used to be within the camp, the tabernacle is now no more, and they've got the tent of meeting outside of the camp. Anyone who wanted to consult with the Lord would go to the tent of meeting, was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out of the tent, all the people would stand up, each at the door of his tent, and they would watch Moses until he entered the tent. When Moses entered the tent, a pillar of cloud would come down and remain at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak to Moses. As all the people saw the pillar of cloud remain at the entrance of the tent, they would stand up and then bow in worship, each one at the door of his tent. Notice something interesting here. There's something about Moses that his worship of God leads to the worship of God from other people. That there is a proximity of Moses and his relationship with God, that when Moses worships God, other people worship. And we see that here, that he goes to the tent. Someone else goes to the tent, nobody does anything. Hey, Jeff's going to the tent. Oh, I don't care, it's Jeff. He's going to the tent. Well, what's he want this time? Hey, Joe's going to the tent. Well, who cares? Moses is going to the tent. Let's all stand at our door and wait. There's just something different about Moses. And we see verse 11. He says this, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face. Just as a man speaks with his friends, then Moses would return to the camp. His assistant, the young man Joshua, son of Nun, would not leave the inside of the tent. It says that Moses speaks to God face to face. Now, this is a figurative expression meaning free and open communication. They'd have free and open communication. That doesn't mean literal face to literal face. We'll talk about that in just a moment. How do you know? We know that based on what we see later in the text. What does he mean that his communication seemed to be different than everybody else? That he spoke to God like a friend. Numbers chapter 12, verse 8 kind of helps us understand this, meaning says that Moses spoke to God directly. Moses heard from God clearly and plainly, while other prophets who would come after him heard from God in dreams or visions. Moses heard from God directly, like a man speaks with his friend. This is a conversation, this encounter with God, like a man would speak to his friend. And in this encounter, we see three requests, three pleas that Moses is about to make. We're going to spend the rest of our time. Plea number one is this. He pleads for the presence of God. So we've already said, God says, hey, your presence, good. Go ahead. Go ahead and go. My promise is good. Go ahead. But my presence, no, it's not going to be there. And that's not okay. In verse 12, Moses is going to make a plea for God's presence. Look what he says in verse 12. Moses said to the Lord, look, you have told me, lead this people up. But you have not let me know whom we will send with me. He said, you said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. Now, if I have indeed found favor with you, please teach me your ways, and I will know you, so that I may find favor with you. Now, consider this, that the nation is your people. And so what's he saying? He says, hey, come on, go with us. Come on, look, this is what you said. This is who you are. We need you to go. Who are you going to send? So come with us. And look at verse 14. And he replied, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Now, we see that, and we go, looks like Moses is good. Well, verse 15, he says, if your presence doesn't go, well, hold on. Verse 14 said he's going. So why does Moses in verse 15 say, if your presence doesn't go? Let's help understand what's happening in verse 14 that confuses me. Because for years I would read verse 14 and I would go, hey, he just said, Moses, he's going. Stop asking. Stop nagging. He's in. But further study this week, that word you in there indicates that what God is saying is, I will go with you, Moses, up there. I will go with you through the land. I will go with you to the land. I'll go with you. Think about it this way. Imagine for a moment you're a big NC State football fan. I know for some of you in the room, that's a really big stretch, but just hang with me for the purposes of the illustration. Imagine you're a huge NC State football fan. Your neighbor has a son who grows up and just dominates football all through Pee Wee League, all through high school, and eventually signs a full scholarship to go play football at UNC. Now, you're tight with this young man. He's half his meals at your house, half his meals at home. You've grown up with this kid. You went to every single high school game. You've cheered him on. You've been a fan of this kid from the beginning. And he signs on the dotted line to play football at UNC. You're a diehard Wolfpack fan. Before he leaves for college, you invite him into your home and you say, look, buddy, I want you to know that I hope you do well. And he looks at you and he said, that means so much. I know you're a diehard Wolfpack fan, and for you to switch allegiances of teams for my sake because I'm going to go play at UNC means so much. You said, well, you didn't hear me. You didn't hear a word I said. I said, I hope you do well. I hope your team loses every single game. But I hope you have 15, 20 tackles every time out. Right? I hope you do well. That's what God's saying here to Moses. He said, Moses, look, I'm going to be with you. And for years, I'd say, well, why did Moses press the issue? No. What God said, I will be with you. And in verse 15, Moses is going to say, no, wow, I appreciate that, God. We need your presence. Look at verse 15. He says, if your presence doesn't go, Moses responded, don't make us go from here. What's he saying? He said, I'd rather have your presence over your promise. It's interesting. How will it be known that I and your people have found favor with you unless you go with us, and I, your people, will be distinguished by this from all other people on the face of the earth? What's Moses saying? He says, Lord, listen. It is your presence that distinguishes us. The land we're going to inherit, that doesn't distinguish us apart from your presence. The stuff we have, the gold we wear, that doesn't distinguish us apart from your presence. Our righteousness and our goodness does not distinguish us. We couldn't even keep it for 40 days. What distinguishes us among all of the people is the presence of God, and we don't want the promise of God apart from the presence of God. God, you must go. Look what God says. Verse 17, the Lord answers Moses, I will do this very thing you have asked, for you have found favor with me, and I know you by name. Now Moses prays. We've got to make this connection before we move on. Moses prays and says, God, if I have found favor with you, please save your people. So all along we've said this, that Moses is the mediator with God. And Moses saying, God, if you found favor with me, save these people. And all along we've said this. He said Moses is a mediator for the Israelite people, and Moses as mediator points us to Jesus as mediator, because Jesus comes to the earth, lives a sinless life, goes to the cross, dies on the cross on our behalf, and through his death on the cross, he is saying, God, I have found favor with you. I have done what they could not do, and through me, save them. And we see that 3 days later, the perfect sacrifice of Christ comes back from the grave, and salvation comes through the work of Jesus Christ, because Jesus came and said, through me, save them. See, we said last week, everywhere throughout the Old Testament, people are pointing us to Jesus. Moses pointing us to Jesus when he goes, hey, if you found favor with me, save them. He's pointing us to one who will come, who will go to the cross on our behalf, and says, if you found favor with me, save them, save us. They said, no, God, your promise without your presence, we're not into that. And so God says, okay, I promise my presence. And so the second thing Noah's pleased for, he's getting a little frisky here, though. I mean, he's got God's presence. To me, it would seem like that would be the time to stop asking for stuff, but not Moses. Look at verse 18. Then Moses said, please let me see your glory. And he said, I will cause my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But he added, you cannot see my face, for humans cannot see me and live. The Lord said, here is a place near me. You are to stand on the rock, and when my glory passes by, I will put you in the crevice of the rock. I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away, and you will see my back, but my face will not be seen. Moses asking to see the glory of God, and God's response essentially, yes and no. He says, look, I'm going to say yes, but there's limits to what you can see. Now, in this, we are dealing with some great mysteries of God. And God talks about human body parts that he may have, his hand, his face. But what we've already said is that God is using physical things to communicate spiritual realities. Right? He said, I'm going to come by and put my hand on your face. Does God have a hand like you have a hand? I don't believe so. But what's he doing? He said, God's going to protect you, Moses, from God. Because you can't see me and live. It's my glory that can't be seen. Now, there's no perfect way to illustrate this as a one-to-one, but let me try it this way. Like there is a sun that today is going to really show off, by the way. If you're not prepared for that, if you don't know about that, today it's really going to show off. Okay, and going to provide some heat into your life that you haven't experienced yet this summer. But we got a sun that's 93 million miles away. It's a pretty long way. If you were to fly there in an airplane flying 600 miles an hour, it would take you 17 years to reach the sun. If you were to get into a car, you were to drive to the sun, maybe you think you're going to road trip it to the sun, you're looking at 200 years to get to the sun. Put your little 4-hour trip this summer in perspective, okay? You're gonna 200 years to get to the sun if you drive there. The sun is so big and powerful from 93 miles away, million miles away, it heats up the earth perfectly. If you were a million miles closer to the sun, you would burn up. 85 of our Earths fit into the sun. And the sun is just one aspect of what God created in a solar system bigger than we can imagine. Among a universe that we can't get our head around. The sun is we are as approachable to the Son as we can possibly get. Any closer, we'd be dead. And again, it's not a perfect one-to-one of the glory of God, but here's what he's saying. He said, I'll let you get a glimpse of my glory, but in full glory, you could not live. You could not live. God in his creation is advertising himself. He is advertising his glory. And to Moses, he's advertising his glory. He says, look, it's about my glory. All the way back when he got the people out of Israel, he said, look, out of Egypt. He said, we're going to get them out of Egypt. Why? So that I may be glorified. And Moses said, hey, if we've done this whole thing for your glory, just go ahead and let me see your glory after all. And look what he says in verse 19. He said, I will cause my goodness to pass in front of you. Moses said, show me your glory. And God says, you want to see my glory? My glory is seen in my goodness. My glory is seen in my goodness. Instead, Moses is saying, God, show me what you look like, essentially. But God is saying to Moses, the best way to know what I look like is to know and understand my goodness. He says, I will cause my goodness to pass in front of you. God doesn't reveal his power. God doesn't reveal his justice. God doesn't reveal his wrath against sin. But God reveals to Moses his goodness. As you walk through life as a Christian, as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, we need to know the goodness of God. God reveals his goodness. If we don't know the goodness of God, we don't know much about God. And what we would see here as you walk through life, you're going to face difficulty. You're going to have hardship. We are going to experience pain. But we want to ask the question, have you experienced and do you know the goodness of God? Because it's being acquainted with the goodness of God and knowing that God at his core is good. It's your kindness, Lord, that leads us to repentance. It's the goodness of God that when you face circumstances that you don't understand, will keep you holding on to God and saying, God, I need your presence. God, your promises are great, but God, I need your presence. And the last thing we see is this, that Moses pleads for renewal and revival. Look at verse 34, or chapter 34, verse 8. We skip through some 34. Read that at home, your homework for this week. Verse 8 said, Moses immediately knelt low on the ground in worship. And he said, my Lord, if I have indeed found favor with you, my Lord, please go with us. Even though this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our iniquity and our sin, and accept us as your own possession. The Lord responded, look, I'm making a covenant in the presence of all your people that I will perform wonders that have never been done in the whole earth or in any nation. All the people you live among will see the Lord's work, for what I am doing with you is all inspiring. Moses said, God, forgive us of our sins. God, forgive us of our iniquity. Accept us as your own possession. You know what's interesting in that language? Is that God previously had said, what about the Israelite people? He said, you're a people for my own possession. And Moses is reminding God of his promise and saying, God, receive us as a people of your possession. God, forgive us of our sin. God, allow revival and renewal to take place among your people. Moses bows low and he says, God, forgive us of our sin. And God says, I will. God renews the covenant with Israel. God renews the covenant. And that what? That their sins will be forgiven. There will be way of atonement made for them. And as we close today, I want us to close thinking about this question and asking the question of what does it look like for us to plead before God for revival and renewal. I'm going to ask the band to come back up, and I want to read a quote as they do. Then we're going to move into a time of prayer. It says this. There's a quote here in a book called Why Revival Tarries. It says this: poverty-stricken as the church is today in many things, she is most stricken here in the place of prayer. Poverty-stricken as the church is today in many things, she is most stricken here in the place of prayer. We have many organizers, but few agonizers. Many players, but few prayers. Many singers, but few clingers. Lots of pastors, but few wrestlers. Many fears, but few tears. The church has much fashion, little passion. Many interferers, few intercessors. Many riders, only a few fighters. Failing here, we fail everywhere. It's talking about this issue of repentance, renewal, and prayer. And Moses pleads for God, for his people. And what we're going to do today is we're going to close with some time of prayer. I'm going to ask Michael just to pray